Well, my father and mother both came from Florence, Italy. He never went back to visit his family. I asked him why. He says, I never go back. I like it here.
From the Battle of Britain to the Battle of Midway, air superiority consistently has been a prelude to military victory. History has proven to favor the power that owns the skies during war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States looked to the skies for the advantage of bombing, conducting reconnaissance, and transporting troops behind enemy lines. However, valuable human life would have to be sacrificed. As such, the United States Air Corps opened their ranks to patriotic volunteers and draftees. America was determined to keep its streak of never losing a war with a foreign nation in the name of liberty.
We all wanted to be in the Air Corps. We wanted to be pilots.
Lazzarini's path didn't involve fighting on the ground in places like the Japanese islands or on the beaches of Normandy. However, because the Air Force was not considered a separate branch from the Army, Lazzarini would have to go through the Army's basic training with other Air Force cadets to use the most advanced technology during the war.
Went to Shepherd Field, Texas. We were there for about 5 months. And they figured you were about the stupidest kid in the block because I was, I thought I was pretty stupid when I was a kid. Well, the instructor gets up. This is a gun. The bullet goes here and it comes out over here and you get a trigger. And that starts it. I mean, that's the way everything was done in there. They took for granted that you were stupid, you didn't know nothing. After that, I went to Montgomery, Alabama to be classified.
President Roosevelt said in a statement today that the Japanese have attacked...
After Pearl Harbor, the United States Army Air Corps was reformed. The newly formed United States Army Air Force sought out to fill the ranks for the war. The cadet flight training program reduced from 9 months to 7 months of training. It was in these 7 months that Lazzarini, who classified as a pilot and bombardier, would learn how to face the enemy head-on for much-needed air superiority.
The instructor says, there's a storm coming in, so keep your eye on the airport. When you see the light flashing, come back in and land. So I'm up there doing my snap rolls, slow rolls, and pylon A's and stuff like that. Geez, I looked, I seen the light flashing. The clouds kept coming in and pushing me down, and finally I was down about 4,000 feet above the ground. And clouds raining, you know. Well, I couldn't see nothing, so geez, I kept looking down at the ground, and I saw a city, a small town there. I recognized it, and there was a railroad track that ran alongside of it. And that track ran into the airport. So I just followed the tracks. And then all of a sudden I seen a bunch of planes on the ground, so I knew where I was. So I went around and got a traffic pattern, and I came in and landed. My instructor, I goes in the room where the instructor was. He says, oh, he cussed me out. You dumb son of a man. What's the matter with you? Oh my gosh. And afterwards he came up to me, he says, good job.
That solo flight wasn't the first time Lazzarini learned an important lesson from his instructor.
Well, we all had parachutes. Every time we went up, we always had parachutes. In fact, well, we sat on them. The seats, well, were built for it. My instructor, well, we both went up, you know, and he says, Lazzarini, well, are you okay? I said, yeah. Well, are you all set? I said, yeah. So he takes the stick. Of course, that's had a stick and rudders, you know. So he takes the stick and he shoves it forward. The plane goes down. And geez, and I goes in the back seat, Geez, I grabbed the stick. My rear end was sticking out, you know. And finally, he pulls out, and then I come back down, you know. And I didn't have my safety belt buckled. And he knew it, that son of a gun.
Although Lazzerini received a few lucky breaks, other cadets weren't as fortunate.
Well, we had a kid there because, you know, you had to be a certain height to get in the Air Corps, and you couldn't be too tall. So you had to be between 5'4" and 6'2", I think. We were all pretty good sizes, except this one kid who was about 5'3.5". That night before he had to go take his physical, 5 of us all got in there. One guy grabbed his head and pulled it up, you know, and other guys grabbed his arms, they grabbed his leg and they stretched him. I think we spent about an hour and a half there that night. And the next day he went over and he passed. But that same kid, on the last day that we were at Lakeland, Florida, that's after we had 60, 70, 80 hours, I don't know, 100 hours. Then the instructor gets in the back seat and the student gets in the front seat, and the student gets to tell the instructor, do a stall or do a snap roll. Well, he says forced landing. Of course, well, when we're flying, well, they tell us, always keep an eye on for a field to land in case you have to make a forced landing. So you're flying, you're looking down, looking at trees or cars or towns and stuff like that, and then you look over, and you figure how high you were. You always had to be prepared for it. Anyway, so the student, the little guy in the front seat, they're flying along, he pulls the throttle back, which was a hand operated. This is what they theorized, that he got up and he turned over, forced landing, he overturned the plane, or a gust of wind got him and flipped him, and it crashed and it killed them both. Boy, that kid, he slept next to me in the lower bunk. I had a military funeral and everything. Boy, that was something else. Never will forget that.
After the events in Lakeland, Florida, Lazzerini went to advanced training. Once cadets arrived at the advanced flying school, they were split up. Cadets either went down the path of single-engine planes or twin-engine planes. Single-engine pilots flew AT-6s and learned combat maneuvers, while twin-engine pilots flew AT-9s, 10s, or 17s. These twin-engine pilots focused on flying the bigger multi-engine planes, as well as flying by instruments at night. Lazzerini took the path of the single-engine plane and was welcomed to the school with more death.
They were pretty tough on us there because before we got there, the upper class, well, they were graduating, and there were 3 guys that went up. One guy got it on the other guy's tail, the other guy got the other guy's tail, and then he kept going in a circle, and then they made the circle smaller and smaller, and finally, well, the first plane, he got so tight he flipped over and he crashed. Second plane crashed, and the third plane crashed. Killed 3 of them. So anyway, well, I got there and I soloed the plane, the AT-6, and one day the captain calls me in, he says, Lazzerini, you were turned in for buzzing a farmhouse. Geez, I mean, I wasn't that way. I says, it couldn't have been me. It had to be another plane. No, it was plane 88. He said, geez, I was flying plane 33 that day. You know, he said it was 88 and you were in it. And so you're washed out. So I was kicked out of the flying part of it.
Once Lazzerini was washed out, he had another chance to keep flying, albeit a very dangerous one. Lazzerini was offered to enroll in glider school. Gliders were used in World War II to drop units behind enemy lines. It has no motor and no landing gear. The glider is meant to crash land with no way to turn back. The soldiers and pilot in the glider are meant to fight through enemy lines until they regroup with friendly troops in order to repeat the process all over again. Although gliders were the military's first stealth aircraft, they were not very efficient in transporting troops behind enemy lines. The inefficiency of the gliders would lead to the creation of paratroopers.
It was a one-way trip, any way you looked at it. Man, and they fed us like kings. Jeez, I just couldn't believe it. Gosh, we had steak and eggs, bacon and eggs, ham and eggs in the morning. We had dessert, coffee or tea or milk. In the afternoon is the same way, supper time, geez, and dessert as much as you want.
It might have been the thin hulls or the one-way trip, but either way, glider pilots were given a lot of freedom compared to other enlisted men. If a glider was filled with only soldiers, it was estimated that 40% of them would be injured or killed. The responsibility of 13 other men's lives were put on glider pilots' shoulders. Not only did they have to block out the deafening C-47's engine that towed them, but they also had to find safe places to crash land at 65 miles per hour without sustaining any injuries. It seemed that the perks that came along with being a glider pilot outweighed the risks of being one. In order to keep pilots' skills at their peak, the Army Air Force provided monetary incentives for pilots to fly extra hours.
I was still a cadet, and if we got 4 hours of flying time in with a motor plane, you know, well, then we got the extra $25. So it got towards the end of the month there, and I got called to go out and fly. It was real bumpy up there, and I got airsick. I threw up in the plane. And geez, I must have had 400, 500 hours at least prior to this. I never got sick once. I got back. Captain didn't say anything, so next day I had to go up for another 2 hours, late in the afternoon again, and I threw up again. And so next day the captain calls me in, Lazzerini, you're grounded. Oh boy. And geez, I tried to tell the captain, I says, look, I says, the guys all got on me because I was the only one there not smoking. And so I picked it up, and geez, well, it was pretty good. So I had a couple in the morning before and after breakfast, and in the afternoon during the break. At night you go to the movies, you come out, and you smoke, and geez, by the end of 3 weeks, I was smoking a pack and a half a day. I tried to tell him, I says, I think it's because I was smoking, but he wouldn't listen. You're grounded.
For Lazzerini, flying and serving his country were the only things he could see himself doing. To have his cause taken away from him was devastating. His harmful smoking habit not only hurt his lungs but caused him to be grounded for good. However, his habit may have ironically saved his life from being one of the approximately 1,000 casualties in the few glider missions that took place before the break of dawn on D-Day. The only option Lazzerini had left after being grounded was to go into radar school.
Then they shipped me to Shepardfield, Texas for radar, because radar was just coming up at that time. And 7, 8 months at least down there, you know, well we had to service them all and then troubleshoot them, and we had to operate them, and we had to read the oscilloscope to see how many planes or boats that were coming. And the Germans surrendered, so we only had the Japs to fight over on the Pacific. And if you had so many points, you could get out. And so I couldn't fly anymore, so I got out.
Shortly after Lazzerini left the army, the atom bomb was dropped on Japan, causing them to surrender. Lazzerini's smoking habit cost him his flying career, but may have saved his life. Although Lazzerini never saw combat, he will be remembered as a man who answered the call to protect others. Men are not defined by how they die in battle, but by how they live. Stories that rapture our attention and remind us to keep fighting for a better future are the stories that must be preserved. Lazzerini has one of those stories. I at first didn't feel that Lazzerini's story was worth telling. It didn't have any action, nor any typical heroic deeds. Lazzerini didn't see combat, but that is not what defines his story. What I believe to be one example of a worthwhile story is one that features failure and continuing past the failure. The view of the man who lives his entire life at the top of the mountain is never as spectacular as the view of the man who has spent his life climbing it. The man who spends his life failing, but still retains the drive to try again and succeed, is vastly better than the man who fails and becomes too afraid to ever try again. Lazzerini's patriotism to protect his country gives him the right to consider his life during World War II a true war story. It's been my pleasure being able to tell Mr. Lazzerini's story through the form of video.